800 men stood in a circle, watching 40,000 enemies surround them in the burning desert. But instead of fear, these Vikings were smiling, because they had come here to die, and they were about to take every single one of their enemies with them to hell. What you're about to witness is the most impossible military victory in human history, where death itself became a weapon, and religious fanaticism transformed ordinary warriors into unstoppable killing machines. By the end of this story, you'll understand why this single battle changed the course of warfare forever, and why some historians still refuse to believe it actually happened. The blood was still wet on their axes when they learned about the Holy Land. It was 1095, and word had just reached the frozen fjords of Norway about Pope Urban's call for a holy war to reclaim Jerusalem from the Muslim Saracens. Most European nobles saw this as a political opportunity, a chance for land and glory. But to King Olaf Magnusson and his Vikings, it was something far more dangerous. It was a divine command that promised them paradise in exchange for slaughter. These weren't the typical Vikings of legend. Christianity had reached Scandinavia, but instead of taming the Norse warrior spirit, it had weaponized it. Now they had God's permission to do what they loved most, kill their enemies without mercy, but with the added bonus that every death in battle guaranteed them eternal paradise. It was the perfect fusion of Viking brutality and religious fanaticism, creating something history had never seen before. The recruitment process was unlike anything ever attempted. King Olaf didn't want ordinary soldiers or even typical Vikings. He wanted the absolute elite, men who had proven themselves not once but dozens of times in the endless wars between Nordic kingdoms. Every candidate had to demonstrate three terrifying qualities: complete mastery with axe and sword, inhuman physical endurance, and most importantly, an unshakable faith in their divine mission. The selection process was brutal. Potential warriors fought to the death against multiple opponents, while priests tested their religious devotion under extreme torture. Only the most fanatical survived. These weren't soldiers anymore. They were religious weapons shaped like men. For months, these chosen 800 endured training that combined ancient Viking combat techniques with new tactics learned from Byzantine mercenaries. They learned something Vikings traditionally never did: fight as one perfect killing machine instead of individual berserkers. They drilled defensive formations, practiced coordinated strikes, and most critically, trained to maintain their discipline under impossible pressure, while channeling their berserker rage with surgical precision. But the physical training was only half the preparation. King Olaf brought in warrior priests and military chaplains to forge their spiritual edge. Every day began and ended with prayers. Every meal was blessed. Every weapon was consecrated. Every man swore a blood oath that death in battle was not failure but victory, because paradise awaited those who died killing infidels. The journey to the Holy Land was designed to build their legend before they even reached the real war. Their first stop was the coasts of Spain, where they deliberately sought out conflicts with Muslim forces. Each fight was a lesson in how different their new enemies were from the Saxons and Danes they'd fought at home. The Saracens were skilled horsemen, deadly archers, and masters of battlefield tactics that no European army had ever encountered. But the Vikings discovered something their enemies weren't prepared for: the kind of desperate, fanatical ferocity that came from men who believed death was victory. Every Spanish battle added to their reputation and taught them crucial lessons about Saracen psychology. By the time they reached Constantinople, they were no longer just warriors. They were a walking nightmare wrapped in religious justification. In Constantinople, they forged alliances with the Byzantine Empire and acquired the weapons that would make them truly unstoppable. The Byzantines, masters of military engineering, provided them with Greek fire, a horrific incendiary substance that burned even on water and couldn't be extinguished by normal means. But the Vikings didn't just take the Greek fire, they improved it, creating their own variant that burned hotter and spread faster. They also acquired superior armor, upgraded weapons, and most importantly, detailed intelligence about Saracen military tactics. When they finally turned toward Jerusalem in the spring of 1096, they were no longer just 800 Vikings. They were 800 perfectly trained, divinely motivated, technologically superior instruments of war. Word of their approach spread across the Muslim world like wildfire, but the Saracen commanders weren't worried. After all, what were 800 men against the vast armies that controlled the Holy Land? Abu Nasr al-Dawla, the military governor of the Jerusalem region, saw their arrival as the perfect opportunity to demonstrate Muslim strength and discourage future Christian incursions. He assembled a massive army of 40,000 men, heavy cavalry, mounted archers, specialized infantry, and even siege engines. To him, this wouldn't be a battle but an extermination, a lesson that would echo across Christendom about the futility of challenging Muslim power. He had no idea he was about to face men who considered extermination a reward, not a threat. The armies met on the scorching plains southeast of Jerusalem, near the ancient ruins of Masada, a location that would prove symbolically perfect for what was about to unfold. The visual contrast was staggering and should have told the story before the fighting even began. On one side stretched endless columns of the Saracen host, 40,000 strong, their banners snapping in the desert wind, the thunder of thousands of hooves and marching feet creating a constant roar that could be heard for miles. On the other side, a single tight square of 800 Vikings, their shields reflecting the brutal Middle Eastern sun, axes gleaming, standing in perfect silence like a monument to death itself. Abu Nasr's strategy was simple and had worked countless times before. His cavalry would surround the Vikings completely, preventing any possibility of escape. His archers would rain arrows down to weaken them, while staying safely out of range. Then his infantry would deliver the killing blow to whatever remained. It was a proven tactic that had crushed armies 10 times larger than this tiny Christian force. He had no reason to believe today would be different. But what Abu Nasr didn't understand was that these 800 men weren't planning to escape, weren't trying to survive, and certainly weren't going to surrender. They had come to Jerusalem to die as martyrs, and they intended to take every single enemy with them to paradise. At dawn, the desert shook with the sound of Saracen war horns as thousands of horsemen began their charge. The sight should have broken any normal army's morale, an unstoppable wall of steel and horseflesh thundering toward them across the burning sand. But instead of holding their traditional line formation, the Vikings did something no military manual had ever described. They exploded outward, splitting into 8 groups of 100 men each, creating what their war leaders called the Wheel of Death. Each group formed its own defensive circle, positioned strategically to create killing zones between them. When the Saracen cavalry hit what they expected to be a solid line of defense, they instead found themselves charging into a nightmare. The charging horsemen suddenly found themselves riding not into a battle line, but into a trap. The Viking circles allowed riders to pass between them, only to close ranks behind, trapping the cavalry in confined killing zones where their numerical advantage became meaningless. Suddenly, instead of a coordinated charge, the Saracen horsemen were scattered, confused, and being struck from all sides simultaneously. The first wave of riders to fall into this trap experienced something no Middle Eastern warrior had ever encountered. Vikings fighting not just with terrifying individual skill, but with perfect coordination that seemed almost telepathic. Every axe strike was supported by a shield. Every defensive move created a counterattack opportunity. Their movements were so synchronized, they fought like a single organism, with 800 deadly limbs. But what truly horrified the Saracens wasn't the Viking tactical brilliance. It was their complete immunity to fear, pain, and the normal human survival instinct. These men had entered what their ancestors called the berserker gang, the battle frenzy. But now it was supercharged by religious fanaticism. They weren't just warriors in a trance. They were believers who knew with absolute certainty that every enemy they killed guaranteed their place in paradise, and every wound they suffered brought them closer to divine reward. They fought with the desperate joy of men who saw death as victory and pain as proof of God's favor. When a Viking was mortally wounded, he didn't retreat or beg for mercy. He used his last breath and final heartbeats to kill as many enemies as possible, laughing as he died. Abu Nasr, watching from his command position on high ground, wasn't initially alarmed by the first 1,000 casualties. That was acceptable losses when facing what he assumed were desperate, doomed men making their final stand. He quickly ordered a second assault, this time using mounted archers to maintain distance while raining arrows down on the Viking positions. But the Norse warriors had prepared for this exact tactic during their months of training. Using shields taken from fallen enemies, and whatever materials they could find, each group had built temporary fortifications that could deflect the arrow storms. When the deadly rain fell, they simply waited patiently behind their improvised walls for the perfect moment to unleash hell. What came next, Muslim chroniclers would later describe as a glimpse of supernatural horror made manifest on earth. The Vikings didn't simply defend against the arrow attack, they turned it into an opportunity for the most devastating counterattack imaginable. During their alliance with the Byzantines, they hadn't just acquired Greek fire, they had perfected it, creating an even more horrific version that burned hotter, spread faster. and was virtually impossible to extinguish. As the Saracen mounted archers closed within range, thinking they were safely picking off doomed enemies, the Vikings launched hundreds of incendiary projectiles simultaneously. In seconds, rings of unquenchable fire erupted around each Viking position, turning the desert battlefield into a vision of hell itself. The psychological effect was immediate and catastrophic. The Saracen horses, bred for desert warfare, but never trained for supernatural fire that seemed to burn the very air, went completely mad with terror. Riders found themselves trapped on panicking animals in the middle of flames that couldn't be dosed with water or sand. The screams of men burning alive mixed with the inhuman shrieking of horses dying in agony, creating a sound that would haunt survivors for the rest of their lives. But the Vikings, instead of staying safely behind their fire barriers, did something that shattered every remaining piece of Saracen morale. They charged directly through their own flames, many of them already burning, screaming ancient prayers in Old Norse as they hacked through enemies who outnumbered them 50-1. Picture the sight that broke the minds of seasoned Muslim warriors, 800 men, many already on fire from their own weapons, sprinting across a hellish battlefield where the very sand was burning. They screamed prayers to their god as they cut down terrified enemies who had expected easy victory, but instead found themselves facing what could only be demons wearing human faces. This wasn't warfare as anyone understood it. This was religious ecstasy expressed through industrial-scale violence, and it was more psychologically devastating than any military tactic ever devised. Some Saracen soldiers simply threw down their weapons and ran, not from cowardice but from the sane human response to witnessing something that challenged their understanding of reality itself. Abu Nas, realizing that conventional tactics were failing against enemies who seemed to welcome death, made a desperate decision. If arrows and cavalry couldn't break these northern fanatics, then sheer overwhelming numbers would have to do the job. He ordered his entire infantry force, 20,000 men, to attack the Viking positions simultaneously from every direction. His plan was brutally simple: smother them under endless waves of bodies, accepting that thousands would die but confident that not even the fiercest warriors could kill 20,000 men. He was about to learn that some forms of human conviction can overcome any mathematical disadvantage. By midday, under the crushing heat of the desert sun, that was literally cooking men alive inside their armor, the final phase of the battle began. 20,000 Saracen infantry surged forward in the largest coordinated assault in the history of Middle Eastern warfare. Their battle cry echoed across the burning desert as they charged toward the Viking positions, confident that numbers alone would finally end this nightmare. But the Norse warriors had been saving their most devastating surprise for exactly this moment. Hidden within their defensive circles were not just the improved Greek fire they had already used, but something even worse: a combination of incendiary chemicals and battlefield psychology that would haunt military commanders for centuries. As the Saracen infantry closed to within 50 meters, the Vikings launched their final innovation in the science of terror warfare. Instead of trying to kill their enemies efficiently, they deployed weapons specifically designed to inflict maximum psychological damage on the survivors. Their improved Greek fire didn't just burn, it created flames that moved like living creatures, seeming to hunt down victims with malevolent intelligence. Mixed with other Byzantine chemicals they had acquired, it produced smoke that caused hallucinations and panic, even in hardened veterans. Most horrifically, they had learned to time the deployment so that the flames would spread in perfect geometric patterns, creating the visual impression that supernatural forces were controlling the battlefield. The effect on 20,000 charging men was like watching human sanity collapse in real time. Warriors who had been running forward with complete confidence suddenly found themselves surrounded by what appeared to be intelligent fire that pursued them personally. The smoke made them see impossible things: dead comrades rising to fight again, demons emerging from the flames, their own weapons turning against them. But through this hell walked the Vikings, completely unaffected, because they had trained in these very conditions and built up immunity to their own chemical weapons. To the hallucinating Saracens, they appeared to be supernatural beings who commanded the very forces of hell, and that image broke something fundamental in the attacking army's collective mind. What followed wasn't a battle but a psychological apocalypse. 20,000 men, the finest infantry in the Muslim world, experienced mass hysteria simultaneously. Some fought invisible enemies. Others attacked their own comrades, believing them to be demons. Many simply stood paralyzed, their minds unable to process what they were witnessing. Through this chaos moved the Vikings, no longer appearing human to their enemies, but like supernatural predators harvesting souls. They killed not with the desperate fury of doomed men, but with the methodical precision of farmers harvesting grain, and every death seemed to feed the flames around them, making them burn brighter and more terrifyingly. Abu Nasr, watching his army disintegrate from psychological factors rather than military defeat, made one final desperate gamble. He called upon his personal guard, 2,000 of the most elite warriors in the Islamic world, veterans of countless campaigns who had never known defeat. If anyone could restore order and destroy these northern demons, it would be them. Their mission was simple: cut through the chaos, find the Viking king, and end this nightmare by killing their leader. These guards were legendary fighters who had faced every kind of enemy from Byzantine cataphracts to Seljuk horse archers, but they were about to encounter something completely outside their experience. When the elite guard clashed with King Olaf and his personal champions, the collision was so violent it could be heard over the screams and flames covering the rest of the battlefield. This was a battle within the battle, the finest warriors of two completely different military traditions, testing their skills against each other in single combat multiplied by hundreds. The Saracen guards fought with the refined techniques of professional soldiers who had spent decades perfecting their craft. The Vikings fought with something beyond technique, a combination of skill, religious conviction, and berserker fury that transformed them into living weapons. For over an hour, the outcome balanced on the edge of a sword blade, with neither side able to gain decisive advantage. The duel that would decide everything came when King Olaf found himself facing Abu Nasr in personal combat. Abu Nasr was no ceremonial commander. He was a warrior who had trained in the finest schools of swordsmanship in Damascus and had survived dozens of personal duels. His skill with curved blade and shield was legendary throughout the Islamic world. But Olaf represented something entirely different, not just individual prowess, but the fusion of Viking battle tradition with religious fanaticism. When their weapons first met, the clash rang across the battlefield like a bell tolling the fate of 40,000 men. The duel lasted only minutes, but those minutes contained the essence of two civilizations in armed conflict. Abu Nasr fought with technique, experience, and the desperation of a commander who knew his army's survival depended on victory. Olaf fought with something that transcended normal human motivation, the absolute certainty that God himself guided every movement of his axe. When the Viking king's weapon finally struck its fatal blow, it wasn't just the death of an enemy commander, but the psychological collapse of an entire military force. The moment Abu Nasr's body hit the burning sand, something broke inside 40,000 men who had begun the day convinced of their inevitable victory. From that moment, what should have been an organized retreat became a stampede of pure terror. 40,000 battle-tested warriors transformed into a mob of panicking individuals, each man concerned only with escaping the supernatural nightmare they believed they had encountered. Soldiers trampled their own comrades in desperate attempts to flee from enemies who seemed to grow stronger with every death they inflicted. Officers who tried to restore order were ignored or killed by their own troops who saw any delay as a death sentence. The legendary discipline of Saracen armies, built over centuries of military tradition, evaporated in minutes under the psychological pressure of facing enemies who fought like they were already dead. King Olaf, seeing 40,000 enemies in full flight, gave the order that would transform this victory into one of history's most complete annihilations. Let none escape to spread fear of Christian weakness. This wasn't a tactical decision, but a religious one. These Vikings believed they were carrying out divine justice, cleansing the holy land of infidels as commanded by God himself. What followed was not a battle, but a 3-day hunt across the desert, as 800 fanatical warriors pursued 40,000 fleeing men with the systematic thoroughness of farmers harvesting a crop. The Vikings had spent months studying desert warfare and Saracen tactics, knowledge they now used to turn pursuit into an art form. They cut off water sources, set ambushes at known travel routes, and used their superior knowledge of the terrain to corner groups of fugitives. But this wasn't simply military strategy anymore. It had become a religious ritual. Every captured enemy was executed with prayers recited over his body, because the Vikings believed they were not committing murder, but performing holy work ordained by God. To them, every death brought the Holy Land one step closer to purification, and every prayer over a fallen enemy earned them additional favor in paradise. On the first day of pursuit, 10,000 Saracens were hunted down and killed. On the second day, 15,000 more. By the third day, Only scattered individuals remained alive from the once mighty army of 40,000. The Vikings, satisfied that they had fulfilled their divine mission, finally ended their pursuit and began the march toward Jerusalem. Behind them lay a desert filled with enough corpses to feed carrion birds for months, and ahead lay a holy city whose Muslim defenders had just received the most terrifying message imaginable. An army of northern fanatics was approaching who considered death in battle not a risk but a reward. The cost to the Vikings themselves had been severe but acceptable by their standards. Of the 800 warriors who had faced impossible odds, only 320 remained alive. But to these men, the casualties weren't losses. They were martyrs who had earned direct passage to paradise through death in holy war. The survivors didn't mourn their fallen comrades but envied them, believing they had achieved the ultimate Viking death, dying gloriously in battle while serving God's will. This attitude would prove crucial in the psychological warfare that was about to sweep across the entire Middle East. News of the massacre spread through the Islamic world faster than any military intelligence network could carry it. The idea that 300 northern fanatics had annihilated 40,000 elite warriors seemed impossible, but the evidence was undeniable. An entire army had simply vanished in the desert, leaving behind only bones and the persistent rumor of supernatural enemies who couldn't be killed because they were already dead. Fear gripped every Muslim military commander from Damascus to Cairo as they tried to understand how such a catastrophe could have occurred and whether their own forces could possibly stand against enemies who welcomed death as enthusiastically as normal men welcomed victory. The psychological impact extended far beyond military circles. Ordinary Muslims throughout the region began to whisper that perhaps Allah had indeed abandoned them, allowing Christian demons to work miracles of destruction in the very heart of the Islamic world. Some communities began evacuating at the mere rumor that the northern devils were approaching. Others started paying tribute to local Christian populations, hoping to avoid the fate that had befallen the great army near Jerusalem. The Vikings had achieved something no conventional military force could have accomplished. They had weaponized terror itself, making their reputation more devastating than their actual presence. King Olaf and his surviving warriors wasted no time exploiting their newfound reputation as supernatural destroyers. They sent messengers to every Christian community in the Holy Land, calling for an uprising against Muslim rule and promising divine protection for any who joined their holy crusade. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Christian populations that had suffered under Islamic domination for centuries suddenly saw hope for liberation, and volunteers flooded to join what they believed was God's own army. Within weeks, the Viking force had grown from 300 survivors to over 5,000 fanatical warriors, all united by the belief that they were participating in a divinely ordained reconquest. What followed was not a conventional military campaign, but a reign of terror that redefined the rules of religious warfare. Every victory, no matter how small, was amplified into legend through carefully managed propaganda that painted the Vikings as angelic warriors sent by God to cleanse the Holy Land. Cities surrendered without resistance at the mere rumor of their approach, and seasoned Muslim commanders, veterans of decades of warfare, refused direct confrontation with enemies whose reputation had transcended the merely military to become supernatural. The Vikings had discovered something that would influence military thinking for centuries. In warfare, perception can be more powerful than reality, and terror can be more effective than strength. They had transformed themselves from a small band of doomed warriors into the nucleus of a movement that threatened to overturn the entire balance of power in the Middle East. Their victory had proved that a small group of absolutely committed believers could achieve the impossible if they were willing to pay any price and make any sacrifice for their cause. But perhaps the most significant impact of the massacre was its effect on European understanding of what holy war could accomplish. When news reached Christian lands, it arrived at the perfect moment, just as religious and political leaders were beginning to organize what would become the First Crusade. The story of 800 Vikings destroying 40,000 Muslims became the ultimate proof that God favored Christian arms, and that victory in the Holy Land was not just possible, but inevitable for those with sufficient faith. Chroniclers across Europe seized upon the tale, embellishing it until it resembled legend more than history. They claimed angels had fought beside the Vikings, that their weapons had been blessed with miraculous power, that no enemy arrow could pierce their divinely protected armor. Whether people believed every detail mattered less than the psychological impact. Thousands of nobles and knights, hearing of this northern miracle, became convinced that divine victory was guaranteed for any Christian warrior who took the cross and marched to Jerusalem. The massacre also established a terrible precedent for the conduct of religious warfare. The Vikings' campaign had demonstrated that absolute brutality could be justified in the name of God, and that the complete annihilation of religious enemies was not only acceptable but holy. This principle would be copied repeatedly by later Crusader armies, turning what might have been territorial conflicts into wars of extermination that would scar the relationship between Christianity and Islam for centuries. King Olaf himself did not live to see the full consequences of his victory. He was killed in 1101 during a siege of Antioch, cut down by Turkish arrows while leading yet another impossible assault against overwhelming odds. But even in death, his legend continued to grow. Epic poems were composed celebrating his deeds, churches were built in his honor, and his name became a battle cry for warriors seeking divine favor in combat. The few Vikings who survived the entire campaign and returned to Scandinavia were treated as living saints, their stories inspiring a new generation of young men to seek glory and paradise in the Holy Land. The model established by Olaf's 800, small elite units of religious fanatics capable of defeating vastly larger conventional armies, would be replicated throughout the crusading period. Military orders like the Knights Templar and the Hospitallers consciously copied the Viking fusion of martial skill with religious devotion, creating warrior monks who combined monastic discipline with battlefield ferocity. The idea that faith could be more powerful than numbers became a cornerstone of Crusader military thinking, with results that were sometimes miraculous and sometimes catastrophic. Looking back across nearly 1,000 years, the massacre near Jerusalem stands as one of history's most extreme demonstrations of what absolute conviction can accomplish. 800 men, united by shared faith and willingness to die for their cause, had achieved what any rational military analysis would have declared impossible. They had proved that the limits of human achievement are often psychological rather than physical, and that sometimes the only barrier between victory and defeat is what people believe is possible. Their story remains both inspiring and terrifying. Inspiring because it shows the incredible heights human beings can reach when united by purpose greater than themselves, and terrifying because it demonstrates how easily that same fanatical devotion can be turned toward destruction and atrocity. The Vikings who died in the desert believed they were serving God's will, but their enemies saw them as demons unleashed upon the earth. Both perceptions contained elements of truth. In the end, the massacre of the 40,000 teaches us that the most dangerous weapon in human history has never been the sword, the gun, or the bomb. It has been the absolute certainty that God is on your side. When that certainty is combined with military skill, tactical brilliance, and complete willingness to die for the cause, it can move more than mountains. It can move armies, topple kingdoms, and reshape the destiny of civilizations. The 800 Vikings who walked into the desert that day understood this truth, and they used it to write their names in blood across the pages of history.